Assistant professor of religion at Dartmouth. He did his PhD at Yale and has published on many diverse figures from Giorgio Agamben, Carl Schmitt, Karl Barth, Eusebius. He has a book coming out from Stanford University Press next year called Divine Currency, the Theological Power of Money in the West. And he regaled me with his current project last night over dinner about thinking about the theological power of debt. So all you students here, you know something about that, right? And we were very lucky to have Professor Singh here at HDS this year. He's a fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions, so he's around and is available. But I have enough time for further conversation.
Well, let me add my word of thanks for the invitation to be part of this important conversation, and my thanks to all of you for being here and for your engagement. I want to begin with a few broad queries. Why do we assume that something that we call a crime requires punishment? Why do we conceive of punishment as compensation? And I should be clear, by we, I mean the collective societal imaginary of the West. I don't mean we here. We're all too woke here for that, right? But what can it possibly mean that inflicting pain is a kind of repayment for deeds done? What I'm getting at is that there's an economy underneath. There's a fundamental notion of exchange and a calculus of values. And where does this economy come from? And how can these things be equated in our minds at the societal level? Furthermore, why do we assume that to be in debt is to be guilty? Why does severe indebtedness raise moral alarms? Why are these two realms conflated? I want us to make strange and call into question these supposedly commonsensical norms. Basically, we're like fish in water trying to describe what wet means. This is the air we breathe, right? My own work has been informed by, for lack of a better term, what I call theological genealogy. This is sort of one of the approaches that I use, and it's looking at the afterlives, the traces, the resonances, or the hauntings of theology within the institutions, practices, and conceptual systems that we inhabit today. Of course, this is a non-linear history. There's no easy one-to-one correspondence. But I've been led to explore the pre-modern and the ancient world, in particular in this regard, and to look at the history of practices, techniques, and institutions as much as ideas. How does theology persist as repressed and yet hidden in plain sight? And part of this requires a certain understanding of secularization, right? That secularization is not simple subtraction. It's not a simple flattening of transcendence or the sacred, but it involves transformations and transmutations. We see old questions answered in new ways, what's been called reoccupied positions. And these are implicit conceptual structures that continue to have impact because of the affective power associated with these theological worldviews, and also because of the ways they gesture toward questions of ultimate concern and horizons of the good that are often implicit. And so in the case of our conversation today, I wonder what implicit and enduring tropes, concepts, and images from Christianity in particular reinforce carcerality. What theologies inform the prison society? And these have been gestured to in a number of ways during our time together, right? My own research has focused on, among other things, understanding money. What on earth money is, where it comes from. Something that, again, that we assume and think we understand, and yet it is something that is actually very strange, right, when you think about it for too long. And I've been led in my study of money to questions about its origins, where it's come from, and these are practices that are shrouded in the midst of history, that happen at the onset of human civilization, when we see the shift from hunter-gatherer societies to the effort to establish living in community in some way, and communal organization. And we can't go much beyond this in terms of the historical record. Scholars of the history of money point to what are called were-guild practices as one of the potential origins for understanding money, but also justice and legality. So were-guild speaks to this tendency to quantify insults and injuries and to think of ways to compensate for them. And these are introduced in human society to stave off these retributive cycles of vengeance that might destabilize society. Now, already, though, when these practices emerge on the historical record, there's economy there, and humans have made strange equivalences. So what on earth might it mean to say and to think that, oh, my ox ran off and gored your son, let me give you these 3 bags of barley to compensate? What sorts of conceptual mechanisms and practices need to be in place for that even to make sense? And historians see were-guild practices as the origins of both money and legal codes, notions of justice. In order for that to appear, though, we need standardization and we need enforcement. Enter sovereignty. So in the transition to the rise of these ancient agrarian empires, and the introduction of hierarchy and centralization and resource allocation, these practices get transformed into what become the roots of money as well as legal codes. Sovereignty standardizes these practices across its territories as a way to manage its populations. The ancient study of money has been supported by the work of an early 20th century English civil servant, Alfred Mitchell Innes, who is little known but extremely influential. He was very influential on Keynes, for example, and other theorists of money. Innes shifted from his study of money, where he described some of these were-guild practices, to a following study on the history of the prison and punishment. So already there, that affiliation is very interesting, right? To be led from money to study the history of the prison. There's some affinity there. So about 70 or 80 years before Foucault's study, Innes, in one of his books, traced the evolution of notions of punishment and pain, at least in the Western imaginary. One of the things he observed is that when sovereignty enters the scene to mediate these communal encounters, there's significant alterations and transformations in how these encounters are perceived. As I mentioned, there's standardization, there's enforcement of quantification. And yet, sovereign power comes to make that infraction or that crime or that insult now about itself. This is no longer just about a harm you've done to your neighbor. This is an offense to sovereignty. This is an offense to the honor of sovereign power. So what we see here are shifts in notions of obligation and debt. Who are you indebted to? Are you indebted to your neighbor or to your governing overlords? And I'll just throw this out there, but part of the lifeblood of sovereignty is displacing its debts onto the governed. Sovereignty lives through the management of debt. So we see that punishment now changes as well. Whereas beforehand it was about compensation to the victim, restitution in some way, now it becomes about pain and harm for the perpetrator. The victim's needs are sidelined. Now eventually we'll see that distinctions between civil and criminal law will evolve to deal with this. But for a broad part of history, this isn't the case. And so attention on the victim and restitution is sidelined to the more important now offense of offending the honor of the sovereign and the need to inflict pain and punishment on that offense. So there's a long history of historical memory in human civilization that ties economy and sovereignty together with punishment and pain. And we can't examine the question of the prison or incarceration without considering the models of sovereignty at work. So this need for compensation and payment and its conflation with pain and punishment gets standardized and regularized under forms of state rule, so much so that they become normalized and commonsensical to this day. We can barely think otherwise. And sadly, emerging Christianity was also unable to think otherwise. Despite resources for thinking otherwise that we see in aspects of preceding Jewish thought, as well as in some strands of so-called heterodox early forms of Christianity, orthodoxy, the official lines of Christian thought that have been disseminated and enforced, appealed to some mechanism to justify salvation. So what I mean by that is, despite language of grace and forgiveness as central, God's welcome and embrace of humanity comes at a cost. An exchange, a payment, a sacrifice must be made. A transaction has to occur. Christ is compensation for humanity's sin. And so here I'm gesturing to what have been termed early ransom theories of atonement. These are the first formalized theories of salvation that I would argue underwrite all ensuing developments in Christian thought about soteriology, about salvation. There's an economy at work. Human sin is construed as debt. Christ is portrayed as the one who redeems or pays the debt. Forgiveness isn't free. Freedom has to be purchased. And one might ask, is this grace? So Christian thought validates and underwrites a worldview where an economy of compensation and retribution reigns supreme. Even God, the Lord of the cosmos, apparently respects debt relationships and offers Christ to settle the terms. So what hope can there be for debt-bound subjects to escape from the logic of debt if even God follows its rules? These early Christian theories of salvation make the image of the debt slave and debt slavery central, and construe freedom from debt slavery as the main way to portray redemption. And of course, we can't interrogate mass incarceration without interrogating the history and logic of slavery. We know that slavery is integral to modernity. The modern project could not get off the ground without the encounter with the New World and the use of slave labor to extract resources and fuel early capital accumulation. Slavery, modernity, and the rise of capitalism are historically co-implicated. This is clear. And we also know that Christianity did much to enforce the slave economy, with language of slaves obeying masters and ideal disciples as being slaves for Christ, right? And of course, this came up in Professor Jennings' talk last night. But I think the specificity of debt slavery requires attention as well. According to these theories, humans are in debt slavery usually to the devil, and debt is construed as a sin and hence as guilt. So we see this conflation there of debt and moral iniquity. So then to be in debt slavery in the real world, in the material world, must also convey some form of moral failure. So by God respecting and following these debt relationships, what sorts of implicit valorization of debt economies does this offer? And what might it mean to examine the project of modernity as displacing societal and sovereign debt upon the slave? We know that slavery and the carcerality of the plantation act as the underside or supplement or foundation to modernization. And as we can recall, part of why the discovery of the New World was so revolutionary was this new access to land, gold, and other resources to fund the regimes of Europe and service their debts. Kingdoms were in debt and needed to pay their bills. Free labor and free resources provided this answer that catapulted Europe to global power. The debts of sovereignty were transferred onto the backs of slave labor and onto the actual land of the New World. Sovereignty survived through managing its debts. So how is this logic of creating debt slaves intrinsic to our modern order? How does the prison industrial complex, which is not merely a site of racialized punishment and pain, but a central site of debt creation and economic production, reveal the underside of modernity to be one of creating and managing its debt slaves? And how did the Christian imagination provide fuel for this? And I'd just like to offer as a closing query, can we imagine salvation without redemption? How can we imagine being saved without an economy of exchange and compensation? Again, I believe this is the undergirding logic to nearly all theories of salvation in Christian tradition. And this informs most assumptions about the goodness and value of punishment in society, punishment as redemptive, suffering as purifying, as transformational and just. Prisons exist in part because of an underlying assumption that to be saved, to be changed, transformed, or redeemed, payment must be made. Payment in actual money, but of course also in pain and time. And even for systems that no longer hold out hope for transforming the incarcerated into docile subjects, but see those that are imprisoned as lost, these systems are sustained by this governing logic that in the name of justice, punishment must be inflicted to balance out the scorecard, and that society, if not the incarcerated, will be redeemed and saved through this sight and scene of violence. And so I ask again, can we imagine salvation without redemption? Can we articulate a vision of what it means to be saved, personally, communally, socially, politically, and cosmically, without the need to resort to a notion of punishment as paying back, or of exchange for pain for the sake of making right? And this strikes me as one of the central tasks for those involved in mobilizing the Christian imagination for more life-giving forms of social transformation. Thank you.
Absolutely. There's of course ways in which notions of hope and eschatology get conflated with the so-called cruel optimism of neoliberalism, right? It's leaning forward, and the ways in which our own hopes and dreams are colonized and disciplined by this order. Absolutely. And so that raises the question of, can we distinguish modes of hope that can be critical hope, right? Hope that can provide distance and authentic horizons of transformation. I think that's a very live and active conversation right now. Absolutely. It's a challenge, and I don't have specific solutions, but I very much feel the force of that question, and I think that's something that we continue to wrestle with. Just to add one thing that I was reminded of with Brother West's invocation of Kafka and the notion of the prison sentence in time and space. The reason that interest exists is because we are dying. The reason why one would want to charge for the use of my money is because my time, I fear death. It's this notion of the limits and this being in existence toward death that then propels debt economies. So what might it mean to interrogate that sense of being imprisoned in time and space, and to interrogate notions of this anxiety of the scarcity of my lifespan on Earth that might actually undermine debt economies.
Just really briefly on the matter of sovereignty, I mean, certainly transformative justice will be threatening to sovereignty, since sovereignty relies on a certain type of predictability, standardization, cataloging, a certain kind of stasis, right? And so transformation by definition, and it makes sense that this is coming for you out of anarchist contexts, which reject sort of these notions of sovereignty. I think also a challenge, though, is that if sovereignty is sort of the pole of stasis, which we can also debate that, neoliberalism is the pole of fluidity, right? That fills the cracks of sovereignty, and so there is always the risk of our moments of moves toward protest and toward transformation being co-opted, redefined, and branded by the neoliberal response. So there's a challenge there in terms of what, it's not simply just change for the sake of change, or, and it requires imagination. And our imaginations have been colonized by the system, right? And so what does it mean to think otherwise? Right. And can we see other horizons?